Thanks, Alyssa. Thanks for sticking around. So I'm Matt Leavitt. I'm an organic agronomist with Albert Lee Seed. Also do seed production for them. If you're not familiar with us, we are a family and employee-run seed company located in Albert Lee. This is our 100th year in business, so it's kind of a cool milestone for us. And since day one, we've really kind of planted our flag in diversity and supplied our first certified organic seed crop in about 1997, and it's only grown from there. So now certified organic seed is about half our total business. It's probably going to continue to grow from there. We recently did acquire Blue River Organic Seeds. Some of you may be aware of that. So natural fit for who we are as a company and kind of everything that we do. I will do a quick plug too, because I'm going to kind of glaze over varietal updates on small grains, at a pretty high level, but we are hosting our next virtual conference. We host usually 2 or 3 per year, and this next one is coming up on February 1st from 9:30 to about 3:30 on Zoom. So, and if you can't make it for whatever reason, we're gonna record it and put it on YouTube. So just did a call out for that. But there's obviously, we're kind of having 3 perspectives on small grain varietal release from our standpoint, which is kind of more the commercial end of things, to kind of the research and development and the extension aspect of releasing new varietals. But when we try to put ourselves in a farmer's mindset about what small grain should we carry, what are the best varieties to launch, obviously things are going to really boil down to us listening to you folks in the room, and meetings like this and field days and even just conversations with folks over the phone are really valuable conversations to try and understand what are your needs, what are your end goals, and what are the best varietals to meet those end goals. Because really, the best variety for someone in Madison is not the same best variety for someone in Minneapolis. And it could be that you want cover crop seed, you want forage, you want maximum grain for animal feed. All those are going to require different characteristics and agronomic values that we can hopefully meet. Another thing too that I have to remind myself of, because I can come away from meetings like this getting really excited about growing things like Kernza and einkorn and all these cool new crops, and it is helpful to take a step back and to kind of analyze what these crops are, how well they're going to fit into your rotation, and maybe even at a higher level, do they make sense to produce in my area? So winter barley is one that's kind of had a frame shift relatively recently because we have new genetics that can actually reliably overwinter in Minnesota. But before that, you could plant winter barley in Minnesota and maybe 1 out of 6 or 7 years it would winter over, and every other year it would winter kill. So things like that sound good on paper, but they may not agronomically meet your needs. And they may not be the right maturity, they may not have the right disease pressure or disease resistance, they may not handle hot humid conditions. So those are all things to kind of think about at a higher level when deciding what variety is going to work. And maybe there's not been enough basic breeding work done to fit your specific farm, your specific situation. And obviously, important rule number 1 before you plant anything is there a market for it? What is your market? Where is it? And does the variety help best meet that market? And specifically, what do they want? If you're trying to raise for different markets, they're all going to have different specific end uses. So they might want a particular variety. They might want their own proprietary genetics for you to raise that you can't get anywhere else, and you have to sign a multi-year offtake agreement with them to get access to those genetics. So those are all considerations to think through when thinking about what specific small grain variety is going to work for your specific situation. Or there might be specific characteristics, falling number, protein, test weight, color, taste. Those are all kind of more qualitative metrics, but they can be hard quantitative as well. If you try to deliver a load of, say, food grade oats to grain millers and it's 34% and they want 36-pound oats, there's going to be some issues there, and you might have to think through what your viable plan B is, which I'll get to in a minute too. And also understanding, what are the deal breakers for your specific end market. So what happens if it comes back hot for GMO, if it's corner beans or some other genetically modified crop? Are you going to get dinged for having ergot or don or other fungal disease? Is it too wet, too dry? All things to be well aware of before you even consider calling up a seed company like ours and buying seed. And something that I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't already know in this room, because organic farmers are much more used to, markets that are a lot farther away and a lot more specialized, but, where is the market? How can you get it there? Can you keep it in condition long enough to really capture that premium? And is it worthwhile enough to make your money back based on wherever that market is? Because markets do exist, and if you're really savvy, you can find those, kind of specialty niche markets with enough work. But, again, it's all got to pencil out for your bottom line. And also, having a plan B for when plan A doesn't go right is definitely pretty important. If you have animals, that's the greatest plan B that ever was, because anything that can be raised and doesn't make spec can be fed to animals and still be profitable. But for other specialty crops, it can be problematic. So taking all that into consideration, us hopefully doing our due diligence and listening to you all in terms of what you're needing, we also try to do our own research and kind of survey what's out there to see what would be a best fit for specifically certified organic farmers. And obviously the best varieties for conventional are not going to be the best varieties for organic. And so we kind of have our standard list of selection criteria when we're launching a new oat variety, a new wheat variety, a new barley variety. And it hopefully matches some of the basic needs that a certified organic crowd would want. But our varieties are coming primarily when it comes to small grains. They're all public varieties, but we do source some genetics from private companies as well, like KWS, LCS, even though they got bought out recently. Also private breeders, and we have started to source a kind of a limited collection of also heritage materials too. So Turkey red wheat, for example, or einkorn or emmer or some of these things. And then how are we evaluating whether or not these varieties are going to perform across a pretty wide geography? Because we work with organic growers all the way from the Dakotas, Montana, Colorado, all the way over to New York, Vermont, and farther south now too. So having access to replicated trial data is really important. We still rely pretty heavily on the university public systems for that. Organizations like PFI, they do a really good replicated on-farm oat testing network. Like I said, these meetings, taking feedback from you all, trying to listen and see what your needs are and to try and hopefully match that. And also, with certain things, there may be one, particular bucket that's available, and sometimes that's what we can take and what we can work with. So I'll just kind of run down some, it's hopefully going to be spring in the next couple months, so we'll just kind of focus on the spring crops. If you want to talk winter crops at a later date or send me an email, let's do that. But I'm just going to kind of focus in on oats, wheat, and barley for the time being. So when we're selecting new oat varieties, obviously these are kind of our list that we've came up with that, every oat variety has to have most of these characteristics before it's going to be viable for us to launch. And, for a conventional setting, maybe you only pick the top one or two of those items, and that's all that's important. They may not care about, height and lodging and, leafiness and weed competitive ability, but it matters to us. So obviously oats, have to have yield, they have to have quality, they have to be reasonably disease resistant, and they have to be able to perform under a lot of different conditions and go a lot of different places. And, usually we're used to carrying, 5 to 6 different varieties for 5 to 6 specific end uses. So that's usually our charge when we're talking to folks, is trying to figure out, what your needs are. And the ones I've highlighted and underlined are kind of newer-ish varieties. So, in terms of what's new in oat varieties, this would kind of be it. For milling oats, Minnesota Pearl, which is a Minnesota oat, is kind of the newest one. It's basically an improved version of Dion, if you're familiar with that oat. For kind of the feed straw scenario, again, Minnesota Pearl. SD Buffalo is another newer variety out of South Dakota State. Usually those oats have fairly decent disease resistance, good yield. So we're kind of interested in that one. And a new one from University of Wisconsin, shout out to the oat breeding program here. We launched a new variety from University of Wisconsin called George Oats, which seems to be a pretty decent performer for feed value and leafy forageability. So that's kind of what's new on the oat horizon. Again, I'm going to blow through this pretty quickly. If you have questions, please ask as I'm going along here. So for barley, there's again specific selection criteria we go through when we try to launch or consider what's important to carry. The biggest couple delineations would be between a 6-row versus a 2-row. And that means 6 rows of grains on the seed head versus 2 rows of grains. And there's different general end uses for each of those. And historically speaking, 6 rows used to be kind of for feed, 2 rows were for malting, but those lines have been pretty blurred. There's nothing to say that a 6-row will out-yield a 2-row. In fact, there's many 2-row barleys that will out-yield a 6-row. And now we have this delineation as well between winter planted versus spring planted, or in the case of, some of you may have heard about MN Equinox, which is a new winter barley variety from University of Minnesota. It's facultative, so you can plant it in the fall and the spring, and it'll still make viable seed. So that's pretty cool. In addition, for selection criteria, again, for conventional folks, you may pick number 4 on that list and bump it up to the top and say that's your most important consideration. But you'll notice that disease resistance is number 3 and even more important than yield, which is really true because barley, especially raised farther east and in areas where it's more humid, is susceptible to Fusarium head blight, which if you have Fusarium head blight infected barley, it's dangerous to feed to animals, it's dangerous to feed to humans, you can't malt it, so that's really that can be a potential deal breaker for marketability of that crop. And obviously that, those same agronomic factors with adaptation and being able to perform across a wide geography is real important too. So what's new there? Admittedly, barley, for a lot of breeding, there are publicly available breeding programs that have released 2-row malting varieties, but that's a pretty limited market. You kind of have to, be vertically integrated with, those outfits to really gain access to those markets. But MN Equinox is the newest one that we're pretty excited about. Again, it's not for everybody's farming situation. It may not be for yours, but we finally have access to a barley that can reliably winter in the upper Midwest, which isn't something we could have said a few years ago. So pretty excited about that. Otherwise, your standard varieties for feed or for milling, like a Quest or a Robust, some of those varieties are, 10 to 20 years old at this point, but they still work very well and can work, in a large amount of areas of the upper Midwest too. And then in addition to some other varieties that we've carried for many years too. So for spring wheat, there again too, disease resistance is pretty paramount. Yeah, go ahead.
The Minnesota Equinox, was that not going to be food grade?
So the question was, Minnesota Equinox, is that not going to be food grade? I think in theory it could be. It could make a grain miller's, milling, purling barley spec. It likely would probably not meet a malting contract, but that's probably not for me to say. But it definitely could meet like a milling quality barley spec for sure. Thanks for the question. Anybody else before we go on here? Okay, I realize I'm talking fast. So again, with wheat, Fusarium head blight resistance, similar to barley, it's pretty paramount to make sure that any spring wheat variety that we're releasing has that characteristic. Because again, Minnesota, Wisconsin, at least as we're talking, relatively recently, is not a hotbed of spring wheat production unless you're talking about the Red River Valley of Minnesota. But not to say that we can't raise high quality spring wheat here, we absolutely can. But things like disease resistance, lodging resistance become a lot more important than for folks out in the Dakotas or Montana, things like that. And there's obviously a lot tighter restrictions on what's acceptable for higher value wheat markets. So things like protein, baking quality. So wheat prices can look fairly attractive, but often their specs are pretty narrow. So we want to make sure that we're releasing varieties that can go out of zone, which means perform in hotter, more humid climates and can perform over a pretty wide geography again. This is some of the same information, but spread across different crop types. So new things on the horizon, at least for us, for spring wheat, is a newer variety of South Dakota State called Ascend, which has some Lang in its background. So it's kind of that good compromise between yield and quality. That seem to be, there's usually an inverse curve between those two things, and we like to try to carry a variety that touches both of those. For milling, in addition to a Bowles or a Glen, which some of you are familiar with, the FBC Dillon is a variety from the Farm Breeding Club from Northern Plains Sustainable Ag, and it was bred specifically for flavor for milling. So it's low protein, which is kind of a little counterintuitive of what you'd think for a spring wheat. But there again, these are varieties that may have a specific end use in mind that may not fit the traditional, pillars of what would consider a good milling wheat. But if you find the right market, you can really specify your variety pretty distinctly. Yeah.
Farmers how to explain that loss of protein, like why that.
Yeah, so the question was how would you kind of like explain a farmer through the benefits of a lower protein spring wheat? Is that
or,
kind of
yeah,
getting it?
How will they talk to their buyer,
their
baker?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and very good question. And I think it probably does boil down to the quality of the relationship there and maybe some give and take between what a baker or miller is looking for, and maybe that it's more relying on those intangibles of flavor, or maybe it bakes up into a really nice loaf or pizza dough or something that would be beneficial other than just the protein level. Because in certain situations, I mean, I'm not a baker, I'm not a miller, but I do know that they often will source lower to higher protein materials to kind of make the flour that they're looking for in certain years. So high protein doesn't always mean more advantageous.
So maybe better for like a blended flour.
Yeah, yep, could be, yep. And just really quick here, as I'll take my last minute or so. So the newest thing that I kind of get a little excited about is having and offering a reliable supply of what ancient grains, which are basically hull-on relatives of modern wheat. So these are your einkorns, your emmers, your spelts. And not to say that these are like ancient plants, right? I mean, people are still doing pretty modern breeding work with einkorn and emmer up in Canada. Sometimes these varieties have been saved for many, many years and have kind of wound up in the marketplace, or they're saved seed that was released by North Dakota State or something. So there's not a lot of clarity in terms of, one einkorn is not equivalent to another. And I'm really in kind of the learning stages too of understanding where these crops are best produced and how to kind of keep a consistent supply of these grains, because there's definitely demand there and there can be specific markets for them. And I think, offering people opportunities for, diverse markets is great. But it's not for everyone, of course. Or heritage grains, which are kind of saved varieties from pre-1950. So these are like your turkey reds or, red fifes, these types of varieties that have specific end markets in mind. And the real cool thing, or perennial grains, which would be a specialty like Kernza. But obviously things to think through, you gotta be a licensed producer to use it in the first place. So new things there is mainly, adapting and carrying a consistent supply. We have a few new spelts on the horizon that we're kind of excited about, and just kind of sorting through what's gonna work. I think for most people, spelt is more produced in like Ohio, but not so much in this region. And then Kernza, which is kind of keeping that supply consistent and having that available. So I think I've already gone over time fairly, so I will hand it off to Julie.
Any initial other questions for Matt while we're transitioning? Do you mind, Julie?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Just a real quick one, Matt. You mentioned about spelt, more so in Ohio, meaning the eastern area, Great Lakes area. Why would that be?
You know, truthfully, I'm still kind of learning more about, you know, where these varieties fit, but I think, you know, winter hardiness is probably a factor on spelt specifically. So we've trialed a couple different varieties to see if they can winter in the kind of the southern tier of zone 5, but it's to be determined.
Other questions for Matt?
I was just wondering if you had ever come across a hard white wheat variety, Clark's Cream, and if that's something that you might look into supplying.
Yeah, good question. I know maybe about 10 years ago we carried a hard white variety called Alice, I think it was. And I think we're a little bit early to the market because, you know, we hardly sold any of it. And my understanding is that hard white is kind of more Pacific Northwest, if I'm, you know, placing that geographically. But again, you know, not to say that you couldn't offer it and have it as an option. But yeah, I'm not familiar with that particular variety.
We've tried that one in New York, and I think we had it in Wisconsin a couple years, and it wasn't great. The problem with whites is that they're more susceptible to pre-harvest sprouting. So Clark's Cream is actually a little more resistant to pre-harvest sprouting, but it wasn't doing as well agronomically. It also, our source had some contamination, I think, with different types, so we, you know, tried to clean it up. We used it as a parent in what I'll talk about here, and none of its progeny made it through. So I think there's stuff to be explored with hard whites, but we definitely need to look at better resistance to pre-harvest sprouting, and then maybe start with some different combinations to see if we can get something that's adapted to the Midwest. Yeah, good question. So I'm going to talk briefly about the variety development process and then a few lines that we're hoping to release soon. This is part of a project that is led by Cornell University, and Wisconsin is part of it, along with several other universities, to really look at developing value-added grains for local and regional grain sheds, and it is funded by the Organic Research and Extension Initiative of the USDA. So the U.S. context for variety development, I think, is advantageous because we still have a lot of public plant breeding programs that are focused on cereal grains, and cereal grains tend to be lower input compared to, say, Europe. So those programs, even if they're not focused on organic, are often generating varieties that can be very good parents or very good varieties just as is in organic cultivation. So that's an advantage. We also have a regional variety release process, so varieties don't have to pass some national test in order to be released, and so we can focus on regional needs. Obviously, the upper Midwest has very different needs from the Pacific Northwest or elsewhere. And then, as most of you know, there's a growing interest in local grains, so there's hopefully a market to pull those through. In the Midwest, what we're working on at UW-Madison is winter bread wheat, and for bread wheat in general, we're looking at milling characteristics and artisanal baking quality, and then resistance to some of these diseases, especially Fusarium head blight, that can make the grain unmarketable as food if you have too much of that in there. So those are some of the top priorities. There are several breeding programs in the upper Midwest that focus on cereal grains. University of Minnesota has a very good hard spring wheat program. So that would be you know, the source of Glen and Bowles and Tom and other varieties. I'm sure you've carried a lot of Minnesota varieties. They also have programs on Kernza, barley, and oats. University of Illinois does soft winter wheat, so that's typically a pastry wheat. The University of Wisconsin has an oat breeding program and has more recently added programs on organic winter bread wheat, which is what I'm going to talk about today, and then looking at food barley that is hull-less, so naked barley. Our role in this seems to be to kill all the winter ones, and then hopefully we're getting some good spring ones, but the breeding program in Minnesota is developing some really good winter hardy ones, so I think we'll be able to make some crosses and hopefully get both winter and spring for that. And this is run by Lucia Gutierrez. She's the cereal grain breeder at UW-Madison, so we work with her. The breeding lines that I'm going to talk about today started actually as crosses between some of the heritage varieties that had really good artisan bread making quality and modern varieties that had good winter hardiness and performed well in organic systems. In Wisconsin, we started trialing some of these lines in 2017, but the crosses actually started several years before that. And then we've worked with Meadowlark Organic and Janie's Farm to do on-farm trials, and a range of artisan bakers to do baking trials to make sure that those varieties are working well for them. We hope to release one or more lines soon. These two here are the ones that are most promising right now. That could change depending on test data, but we have those in foundation seed right now. And so those might be out, and Keith will talk more about that process, but those might be out in the next 2 to 3 years. So the process was first in New York. So this was started at Cornell. I was a postdoc there. We trialed a lot of varieties under organic management. We tested for protein, falling number, and vomitoxin. That's what the toxin from Fusarium head blight is. And then we worked with bakers to do some baking trials. We selected parents, we made crosses, and then we started selecting in the field. Fusarium tolerance is hard to screen in the field, so this is what Cornell does. They inoculate and they spray this is all water. So they inoculate and then they spray water during flowering to make the conditions the most ideal for Fusarium. And then everything is scored, and the things that are not resistant are discarded, and the most resistant ones advance. Pre-harvest sprouting is similar. Things are clipped right at physiological maturity, taken into the greenhouse and misted for as long as it takes. I think it's like several days, and then they're scored regularly for how quickly they sprout. And so you get rid of everything that sprouts and keep the ones that don't. So that early generation screening was done at Cornell. Then they came out here in 2017. And the first thing we did was try to kill them. So only the ones that survived the winter stayed in the program, and our winters typically are a little harder than the ones in New York, so we had quite a few that dropped out there. This is the work of Pablo Sandro. He's a PhD student in the plant breeding program here at UW, working with Lucia and I. So after we killed most of them, we then put the rest in larger trials. We did a lot of disease scoring to try to make sure that things were resistant, and a lot of agronomics. So a lot of these crosses are actually taller than most modern wheats, so we wanted to make sure they didn't lodge. It was important to get farmer feedback, so we brought farmers. Some of you might have been part of some of the field days to get feedback on those lines, as well as the on-farm trials, and then looking, of course, at things like earliness and yield that are important. We did this in a system that mimicked as closely as possible organic systems in the region. So it's certified organic land on the research station, and it's winter frost seeded with clover, so that we try to actually be selecting in the system that a lot of people use. We had a network of trials once we got enough seed on research stations. Then we also did the on-farm trials here in the Midwest, and we had one in New York. And so we really tried to test, how well these did on a broad range of environments. And then the best of those, we got a great team of bakers together in Madison the first year. That was, I think, the day the university shut down for COVID. We were having the baking test, and then The next year it was remote. This past year, it was also remote, and then we're doing kind of a hybrid this actually in a few weeks, really trying to make sure that these varieties work for bakers so that if that is the end market, they are going to want to buy them from farmers in the region. So they scored them throughout a 2-day bake process, and then we also invited the public in to do some taste tests, and we had both the bakers and the public evaluate the taste. So they've been through a fairly rigorous screening process. I will say, like, the goal here is to get a variety that does well in organic systems, is fairly resilient to changes in the environment, and that does very well for artisanal baking. And so what we were doing, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide because we can come back to it for questions. What we're trying to do is get something that is basically equivalent to existing varieties for yield, bakes well at a lower protein content, or doesn't need to be blended with as much spring wheat, and then has good resistance to fusarium and good stability under stress. And so, I don't know, yeah, okay, so this is Warthog, that's the check. You can see that it's not significantly different, but it does yield a little better overall. But then if you look at some of the on-farm trials here, the 2 breeding lines are doing better. In Illinois, it was pretty much equivalent for yield. And then for protein, they're all around 10%. This one's a little higher. These were all making good loaves of bread. They were all better than, these 2 were better than Warthog. And so they wouldn't need as much spring wheat in order to be really viable in a bakery. And so we think those 2 have potential. Like I said, it's still, still not quite released yet. We need to make sure they're going to hold up for you. But those are the ones that are kind of in the pipeline, these 2 here. And then we also are making new crosses. And so the idea is not to just release a couple varieties and be done with it, but really to continue to make progress on yield and on protein and on resistance to fusarium. So with that, we have a lot of people that made this possible, particularly the farmers and the bakers that helped us with all of the evaluations. And I'm happy to answer questions maybe at the end. I don't know, probably want to hand it over to Keith and then answer questions unless anyone has a clarification question right now. Go ahead.
What is this, like, on the results, the Wisconsin farms had such better yield than Illinois? Is it because of the climate difference?
So some of it is probably just variation from one farm to the next. We also don't have great yields on our station. But that's not necessarily because the station isn't in a good environment. I mean, some of it is because we do try to stress them to make sure that they will hold up to stress. And this measure of stability, what this tells us is that Warthog tends to do better at higher fertility environments. The other ones are more stable as you get to more stressful environments, and particularly we had a drought year, and some of these ones that were taller probably had a deeper root system, and so they may have done better partly because of that. So we're seeing more advantages on the more stressful end. I think we need, more data points to know if it's a farm thing or a region thing. And they're also in very small plots, so it's more useful to compare them between each other than to compare them to some overall yield, because in a small plot trial, you're always extrapolating to like a theoretical yield per acre, but the real comparison is just like relative to the other ones in the trial. Yeah. Yes?
And that last question there, could also it be something as simple as planting dates? For instance, on Harold's farm there, Illinois, when could that be? Maybe after beans came out, and the other 2 locations, different rotation?
Yes.
So it was before, in other words, he wasn't waiting for soybean harvest.
Yep. Yeah. All of that is just in the kind of environment factor. And that's why we can't really draw any conclusions about the absolute number for the yield. It's just the relative value. Yep. All right.
Any other questions while we transition to Keith?
Here I am, the last thing between you and heading home.
Last but not least.
Okay, I'll try and be quick about it. So, my name's Keith Williams. I'm an outreach specialist with the University of Wisconsin, and I focus on food grade and culinary grains, really. In my appointments with the horticulture department, I work with Julie's lab. I also work with the Artisan Grain Collaborative and lead the research and variety testing group. So my background is I'm a plant breeder by training. I trained as a wheat breeder, and then I worked in the seed industry as a corn breeder for several years, and now I do more work with chefs and kind of breeding things for flavor and end use rather than just yield. And when I was asked to talk today, I thought rather than just hit you with a list of varieties that are really great for culinary uses, I'd do a little bit of a bigger picture in how we kind of understand varieties and locate new cultivars that can bring some value to your farms or your businesses if you're a food maker or a food entrepreneur. So for me, if I think about genetic diversity and trying to find new varieties, success is two things really. It's that we're working with the existing biodiversity in all of the genetics that we have available to us. There's really a deep pool of that material that we can dive into. So we have some research and innovation, a lot of the work that Julie was describing that happens through the lab here. The other piece that should be a 2, not a double 1 up there, is that once we discover some value in these genetics, we have to make sure that we can get them to scale, that we have seed for the supply chain, that we can not just identify a good cultivar, but we can commercialize it and we can develop businesses and we can develop a market for it. And that's really a lot of what Matt was talking about, where Albert Lee kind of helps get things out there and on acreage, significant acreage. I just wanted to start by saying we don't lack for biodiversity. Sometimes folks will really say, oh, we have this erosion of genetic diversity, we're losing genetic diversity, and that diversity might not be on the landscape, but there is no shortage of it for breeders or farmers or researchers to tap into. This is just a screenshot from the USDA seed bank, which I get into all the time to order seed and explore genetics. And it didn't work out so great, but if you look in the lower level here, it says, how many results do you want us to return? Up to 10,000. And if you just put in Zea maize for corn, or if you look for wheat or rye or any grain, there's literally thousands of accessions you can get into. Maize corn is kind of my sweet spot. I know there's over 8,000 different accessions you can tap into. So we don't lack for biodiversity, and there's no shortage of that. And some of those genetics could be great things for organic systems, have new disease resistances, all sorts of untapped potential. What we really don't have is a thorough understanding of it. What we're trying to do, whether you're a producer growing a crop, a new cultivar, you're a breeder doing research work, is you're trying to discover value out of that big bag of genetic diversity. And that's really a challenge, but it's an exciting thing, and it's something we really all have to be involved in, because we know agriculture in particular is going to face a lot of challenges with changing climate, with increasing food costs, with a lot of things we're up against. And so there's a few ways we kind of figure out where that value is in genetics and come up with new varieties and provide new types of seed to farmers and growers. And Matt did a really great job covering where Albert Lee talks about the commercialization and how they're working especially with like heritage grains and sort of reviving some of these things that have value in the marketplace but might have been limited on seed stock in previous years. Julie did a great overview of the breeding program and the work happening at the university here and other universities, and that's very similar to how you would see breeding work happening in a company, in a traditional breeding pipeline. The two things I wanted to talk about are a little different. but they're really valuable in understanding how you can tap into new genetics and new varieties for your farm and your business. And I wanted to talk about the idea of I don't like the term end users, it sounds kind of negative, but folks that are running businesses, food businesses, mills, bakers, brewers, they can identify genetics and pull those forward into the marketplace. So I want to give some examples and talk about how that works, and some not new, but some varieties that are really getting new exposure in the marketplace through the action of folks championing those genetics and bringing them forward. The other piece I'm going to talk about is how we can use networks like OGRAIN, like the Artisan Grain Collaborative, networks that you are all part of by just sitting in this room, to start to collectively gain knowledge about the diversity of genetics and bring forward varieties that might have found success on another farm and could be successful on your farm. So first thing I'm going to talk about is the idea of pulling genetics forward, bringing forward cultivars and having folks that are really face forward with the public and promoting and championing these new genetics. And so any one of these kind of 4 ways that we discover new varieties or new value in seed genetics have pros and cons. And with this model, the challenges really are that there's definitely a scaling mismatch. We're really good at producing grains at scale in the Midwest. But if you're a smaller food entrepreneur, you're wanting to work with a particular grain, you might not be able to hit contract minimums. And so you might need to go in with other growers, sort of bulk orders. There's just a scaling difficulty we run into all the way from, again, contract minimums through infrastructure, through everything. We also run into limited seed supply, and I think some of you may have had experiences with that. Again, Matt, it's great to see you guys are doing some heritage grains, because I know there's demand, but not always a reliable seed supply for some of these things. So that's really the challenge with this approach. But there's really good opportunities. I mean, from my perspective, having done this work for a few years now, I think this model is the most influential. And businesses that take this approach, if they can figure out those challenging pieces of it, they can create huge value. They can steward and shepherd varieties that would otherwise be lost, and they can create premium products that sell for a good amount of money if they can figure out the challenges. The other thing that I think is great about this is when you see this model in action, this is something happening with business owners, and so they're very pragmatic. I think sometimes when we talk about biodiversity, old varieties, we can get kind of nostalgic about it or even romanticize some of these things. And when you see this model in action, these folks are really pragmatic, and something that can't pencil out or is just going to be a nightmare to work with very quickly gets pushed out of the system. So I think it's a robust kind of screening and sort of development process. I want to give 3 examples to talk about this, and there's a lot more than 3. But one is really great. This is a local example from Meadowlark Community Mill, John and Hallie. They're working with this hard white spring wheat called Snowbird. It's something that they started producing. It's really popular. It works well for them. It's a Canadian release. It's not commercially available anymore as far as seed. I believe that's what they told me. And so this is something which works well here. It's kind of unique. It's a hard white spring, and they are shepherding those genetics, making sure they don't get lost from the landscape, because in the sense of big ag, from wherever they were developed, they don't hit enough volume, and they would otherwise be sort of phased out or lost from the roster of genetics that might be available to a grower or to a baker. So this is, again, another example, or a first example of how a mill can sort of pull forward genetics, find something valuable, and then work to steward those seeds and keep that variety out there, communicate it to the public. Second example I'm going to give is from a bakery in Minneapolis. It's called Laune Bread. I'm based in Minneapolis, so I know all the folks involved in this story really well. Laune Bread as a bakery is owned by 2 bakers, Chris and Tiff, and they wanted to work with a particular Minnesota cultivar called Linkert, but they found that it was not readily available. They liked this variety for its baking qualities, flavor, all the things that bakers kind of look at and evaluate. And so because they couldn't find it, what they did was they decided to get really proactive about it. And Chris, who is the guy in the red in the picture there, he went out and found a local grower in Minnesota, Askegaard Organic Farms, Mark Askegaard and his daughter Beth McCannon. Mark is the guy in the blue. They're up Fargo, Moorhead area. They run a 2,000-acre organic farm, grain operation. And Chris figured out a way to contract with them to produce Linkert. He then worked with other bakers that would help sort of hit the minimums for them to be able to get this milled at one of our local artisan mills, Bakersfield Flour. And now when you go into Laune Bread, they're very forward about all of the wheat varieties that go into their products. So you will know when you're getting bread that's made with Linkert. And they really hold up that story of it being a local Minnesota cultivar, grown in Minnesota, milled in Minnesota, produced there in the bakery. And again, you can't get better than that for advocating for local food systems and the power of us all sort of pulling in the same direction. Third example I'm going to give is from the world of spirits, and this is from Michigan. So Mammoth Distillery in Michigan had heard about this variety of rye called Rosen. And this is a historic variety from Michigan. It had been grown there and had a track record as being really great for whiskey, beginning of the 20th century. But it sort of fell out of favor. You couldn't really get seed. And what Mammoth did was they went out, they partnered with Michigan State University, and actually the Michigan DNR, I believe. They got into the USDA seed bank and started working with the university to increase seed of this variety on Manitou Island, which is a state park. It's an isolated island. They wanted to be able to maintain the purity of their seed stock and this variety. Rye is outcrossing, and I think Sandy Seiberg told me you need like a mile isolation distance between fields to keep it from crossing, so they wanted this isolation. And they went from that packet of seed that you get from the USDA, they send you 100 seeds usually, so that's what you start with, and they now are producing several acres of rosin, Rosen, again I'm not quite sure on the pronunciation, but they're putting that forward in an identity-preserved premium rye whiskey. And this has gained a lot of traction. The Michigan legislature actually declared a Rosin Rye Day in Michigan last year. So they're really developing a unique product that's cultivar forward, right? And potentially creating a lot of value for them and sort of bringing something out of the history books and out of the shelves in a cooler somewhere into the field where it's actually evolving and changing and growing along with us as people, which is great. So again, that's 3 examples of this pull model of varieties being held up and championed by people making foods, beverages, folks that just like to eat really tasty grains. There's lots of other examples from across the Midwest and throughout the country, but it's a very powerful thing. The last piece I want to talk about here is if we get away from the idea of just a simple, like one group sort of finding something and then teaming up to get that forward, I want to talk about how networks like OGRAIN, Artisan Grain Collaborative, all of these things function as a way for us to share information about varieties we're trying, to do some more participatory work and really engage in diving into all of that genetic diversity and finding where that value is, which again, we don't fully understand the value of a lot of these genetics. So when we're working with these community networks, which you're all part of, again, there are some challenges. Things can be kind of subjective. We work over a large geography, and you need to verify locally if something is going to work agronomically, also if it fits your market. You also have to realize these things take time. Breeding programs, product development programs take time, even in highly resourced, super organized, efficient types of outfits. And so in a community network, it's a little more dynamic. And this really needs commitment from people involved in this. Lots of times this can be sort of a passion project for people that are involved. But again, there's very powerful upsides to working through these networks and starting to look at the differences in genetics and varieties. The real opportunity piece of it is that it's community-based, so it tends to be more open. It's easier for people to access this knowledge, access genetics, and there's also not the traditional constraints or guardrails that you tend to see in breeding programs in universities or companies. People can try things that are a little bit different that might not really fit into the more structured formal programs, and that's where innovation can happen. And we can see really cool new varieties and new approaches come out into the marketplace. The other piece is that this is very resilient. This takes a lot of work, it takes a lot of time, but when a lot of people are involved in it, as people come and go, projects can be batoned from one party to the other. This makes it more resilient. So it's a little messier, a little more challenging at times, but I think it's much more robust than putting all your eggs in one basket, so to speak. What can come out of this? Well, as we meet together as a network and talk about what we're doing as we experiment with new varieties and test new things, all of that information can come together and be shared out through various resources. So we just recently, as of yesterday, I believe, put online this new Grower's Guide to Producing Organic and Food-Grade Grains in the Midwest. This is really an intro guide for people. You all have a card on your table which has a QR code to it. It's here as well. I included this because part of this is a variety listing, right, where we talk about varieties which we compiled from talking with growers and people running food businesses, asking them what varieties of rye, wheat, and open pollinated corn do you like to work with, or are you finding are valuable as you run your businesses. And some of these are varieties which are in seed catalogs. You can see the hybrid rye that are from Albert Lee in there, but we also have things like OP corn. I've heard a number of people over the course of this conference talk about Bloody Butcher or Wapsie, which is great for me to hear because I'm kind of a corn guy at heart. But most growers are maintaining that seed stock themselves. And so this is just a nice way to, again, have conversations and share that information out for people that might want to be getting into open pollinated corn but have never done it before. There are some things in here that might not otherwise be seen if you're just going out and looking at traditional product guides. The other piece that's really great about these networks working together and trying different things when it comes to developing varieties or new cultivars is, again, you can play outside of the lines a little bit here. This is, again, another example from Meadowlark locally. And this is a product, a population high protein flour coming from Meadowlark. And this is something where John and Hallie, talking with Julie, basically took 11 different varieties of wheat and grew them out together and just started harvesting and saving seed. And so what they have now is what you know, in traditional breeding, you might call a synthetic variety. It's more typical to maybe how alfalfa breeders would create a new variety, but they're applying it in small grains. And this seems to work really well on their farm. Again, after several years of doing this, it's tough to say what the genetic makeup of this is because it's a mix of different varieties and some are going to be kind of, you know, evolving out of that population mix, and some might be increasing their frequency in that mix over time. But it's very dynamic, and they've come up with a really cool, very locally adapted, locally useful, you know, what you might call cultivar or mix, using something that you wouldn't normally see coming out of a university even or a traditional seed company. Last thing I'm going to say is if any of this sounds exciting, by being in this room or maybe joining up with the Artisan Grain Collaborative, everybody can participate in this. Like there's no lack of, you know, there's no barrier to getting into some of this. I work on the research and variety testing group for the Artisan Grain Collaborative. If you are a member of that organization, you can participate in our group. We meet fairly regularly, bi-monthly, and there's opportunities for people to trial new genetics in small scale on their farm. There's opportunities for people to trial different cultivars in the kitchen and through some of the milling and baking tests, very similar to the work that Julie was talking about earlier. And I think that's incredibly important because just, you know, to step back and give perspective on, again, commitment and timeline when you're in this world of breeding or trying to find value in genetics and create this, you know, great food system for people. You know, after a breeding decision is made, it might take 4 to 6 years to commercialize, to get something from that licensing point through to being on significant acreage in the Midwest. And that's after the breeding decision is made. If you stop and look back from that point and think upstream, some of the work like Julie was describing, it can take 3 to 4 years to get enough seed to really understand which thing you even want to move forward with or commercialize. And so like a conservative estimate, you're looking at maybe a decade to go from this initial look at genetics through to a named variety that you're going to be able to produce at scale. And that's a pretty big commitment. And you might ask yourself, how can a single person farm organization commit to that? It seems kind of risky, right? What if something happens to that one single entity doing that work? And we've seen breeding programs go away that were the main source of genetics for one particular crop. It's a tricky thing, and that's where, again, participating through these networks can add a level of resiliency and robustness to what we're doing here. As we share knowledge about these different varieties, what they are better used for in food applications or making beverages, things like that. And I know that this saying gets used a lot, but it's really fitting here. I think if you're, again, as a plant breeder at heart, if you want to move really fast through a breeding pipeline, you know, if you're doing that alone and calling all the shots, you can move real fast. But it's risky, and if you are thinking about longevity of your program, of your regional food system, you need to work collectively with other people. You have to go together to do that. And you know, OGRAIN is great because it's a forum for all of us to connect and do these types of things. So